Has this ever happened to you? Why don't I enjoy being around people like I used to? If that question stirred something inside you, you're probably not alone. Many folks in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s find themselves pulling away from social circles they once cherished. It's not that they've stopped caring. It's not that they've become cold or bitter. It's that something deep down has changed. And more often than not, that change is born from wisdom, not weakness. In this narrative, we're going to explore 6 powerful reasons why you might be avoiding people now, even if you were once the life of the party. These aren't surface-level observations. Each one reflects something real, something many older adults have experienced, even if they rarely talk about it. Some reasons might surprise you. Others might hit close to home. But one thing for sure, by the end of this piece, you'll understand yourself better, and maybe even forgive yourself a little more for needing space. You'll realize that stepping back from certain people isn't something to be ashamed of. In fact, it might be one of the healthiest, wisest things you've done for yourself. Reason number 1, the way to past betrayals. As time passes, we gather more than just memories. We collect bruises. Some are easy to forget, a disagreement here, a misunderstanding there. But others leave deeper marks, betrayals, rejections, moments when we open our hearts only to have them dismissed or misused. And as we get older, we begin to feel the quiet echo of those wounds more clearly. We stop offering ourselves so freely, not because we're angry, but because we've learned that not everyone deserves a front row seat to our lives. Take Eleanor, for example, an 81-year-old woman who once hosted dinner parties every weekend. She loved laughter, music, and having her house filled with people. But over the years, things changed. Friends drifted. One betrayed a confidence. Another disappeared when her husband passed away. It wasn't one big heartbreak. It was a steady drip of small disappointments. Now, she chooses solitude more often than company. Not because she hates people, but because she values peace more than pretense. There's a kind protection that grows in old age, a shell built from experience. It doesn't always feel good, but it often feels necessary. And when you live long enough to see how quickly people can change or leave you, you start guarding your time, your heart, and your trust. It's not about being cold. It's about being careful. Older adults have often loved deeply, given generously, and been let down without warning. That repeated cycle teaches you to pause, to evaluate, to pull back when something doesn't feel safe or sincere. You start paying attention not to what people say, but to how they make you feel after they've left the room. Psychologists call this relational fatigue, when the cost of connection begins to outweigh the joy. And it's especially common in those who have weathered emotional storms. There's no shame in that. It simply means you've lived. You've seen what people are capable of, both good and bad. And when you choose distance now, it's not out of bitterness. It's wisdom. It's the recognition that your heart at this stage of life is something sacred, and not everyone deserves access to it anymore. Reason number 2, the craving for peace over small talk. In your younger years, you may have tolerated chatter that led nowhere, conversations filled with pleasantries, gossip, or talk just for the sake of noise. But as you grow older, that tolerance starts to thin. It's not that you're antisocial. It's that you've begun to understand the deep value of peace. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels nourishing. And when you found that kind of inner quiet, it becomes harder to give it up for shallow company. Take Harold, a 76-year-old man who used to work in sales. He was charming, outgoing, and knew how to make conversation with anyone. But now, he avoids events that require endless mingling. He no longer attends large family functions unless he truly feels up to it. When asked why, he simply says, "I'm tired of talking just to talk." His preference isn't for isolation. It's for meaning, for honesty, for quiet moments that don't require performance. As we age, our emotional energy becomes more precious. The desire to impress fades. The urge to prove ourselves wanes. What rises instead is a desire for authenticity. We want interactions that feel real, not rehearsed. And if that can't be found, many would rather stay home with a book and a cup of tea than fill the room with noise that leaves them feeling lonelier than they did before they arrived. This isn't about being standoffish. It's about being selective. There's a dignity in choosing your surroundings and the people you share them with. You've earned the right to preserve your energy, to prioritize peace, to decline an invitation without guilt. That's not avoidance, that's maturity. And the more we lean into this kind of discernment, the more we realize that life doesn't require a crowd to be rich. Sometimes, one meaningful conversation, or even a quiet evening alone, is more fulfilling than hours of forced interaction. So, if you've been pulling back lately, opting out of the banter, skipping the noisy gatherings, know this: you're not becoming cold. You're becoming clear about what fills you up, clear about what drains you. And that clarity is one of the greatest gifts of aging. Reason number 3, the feeling that people don't understand you anymore. There comes a moment in life when you look around and realize the world has changed, and so have you. The slang is different. The values are different. The speed of everything, conversations, expectations, even relationships, feels almost dizzying. And amid all that change, you might start to feel invisible, unheard, or simply out of place, not because you've done anything wrong, but because people no longer take the time to understand where you're coming from. Take Marie, a 79-year-old retired school teacher. She used to love sitting with her younger relatives, sharing stories from her life, how she raised 5 kids, managed a home, worked full-time, and still found time to volunteer. But nowadays, she says they barely ask questions. When she speaks, they nod politely and check their phones. It's not malicious, it's just disconnect. And over time, that gap begins to feel like a canyon. This is one of the quieter reasons people start pulling away. It's not that they don't care, it's that being in environments where you're not truly heard starts to feel exhausting. And slowly, you begin to choose your own company, not because it's better, but because it's safer. You know how deeply you feel, how much you've lived, how much wisdom you carry. But when others stop seeing it, it's easy to stop offering it. This kind of loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being misunderstood. You might be surrounded by people but feel completely unseen. You share a thought and they change the subject. You express concern and they call you dramatic. After enough of these moments, you begin to believe that maybe silence is easier. Psychologists call this emotional invalidation, when your feelings are subtly dismissed or minimized. And it's something that affects many older adults more than we talk about, because it doesn't happen through outright rejection. It happens through small moments that pile up over time. But here's the truth: your thoughts still matter. Your voice still holds power. And just because others fail to hear you doesn't mean you've lost value. It simply means you've outgrown certain conversations. And that's okay. Sometimes the solution isn't to force your way into their world. It's to find people or places where you don't have to explain yourself so much, where your presence is enough, where someone actually listens, not just waits for their turn to speak. And when those people are few and far between, it's natural to pull back, to protect your energy, and to find comfort in your own space. Because in that space, you are fully seen by yourself. And that is never something to be ashamed of. Reason number 4, the fear of becoming a burden. As we grow older, there's a quiet fear that begins to settle in, a fear not of illness or even death, but becoming a burden to the people we love. It's a fear that's hard to name, yet impossible to ignore. You don't want to interrupt someone's busy day. You don't want to ask for help even when you need it. And so you stay silent. You stay home. You stay distant. This isn't about pride. It's about love, about dignity, about not wanting your presence to feel like pressure. You start turning down invitations, not because you don't want to go, but because you don't want someone to feel obligated to pick you up. You hesitate to share your worries, not because you don't trust them, but because you don't want to weigh them down. And so your world quietly begins to shrink. Take Frank, an 84-year-old widower who used to spend weekends with his daughter's family. As his mobility declined, he found himself declining their invitations more often. When asked why, he said, "I don't want them rearranging their lives around me. They've got kids, jobs. I'll just slow them down." And while his family never made him feel unwelcome, the fear of becoming a problem overpowered his desire for connection. That's the paradox so many older adults face. The more you need others, the less you want to need them. The more you value relationships, the more you hesitate to reach out, because you've spent a lifetime being strong, being the caregiver, being the one others leaned on. And now, asking for help feels unfamiliar, maybe even shameful. This fear is rooted in something deeply human. The desire to be loved not out of duty, but out of delight. And when you sense that your presence might be creating inconvenience, you begin to retreat. You'd rather be alone than feel like an obligation. But here's the truth. People who love you want to show up for you. They may not always say it right. They may not always do it perfectly. But your worth isn't measured by your independence. It's measured by your presence. And if the people around you truly care, your needs will never be a burden. They'll be a privilege. Still, the fear lingers and it shapes behavior. You stay quiet when you want to speak. You stay put when you want to visit. You stay behind when you want to join. And gradually, avoiding people becomes easier than risking the discomfort of needing them. Reason number 5, the quiet ending of old connections. Some relationships don't end with fights or farewells. They simply fade. People grow in different directions. Priorities shift. Life pulls you apart in slow, almost unnoticeable ways. You don't mean to drift. You just do. And one day, you wake up and realize that the people who once filled your calendar are no longer part of your day-to-day life. It's not always sad. Sometimes it's peaceful, but other times it leaves a kind of ache, like you've outgrown something you once loved. You think back on the lunches, the phone calls, the shared laughter, and you wonder where it all went. Did they change? Did you? Maybe both. Consider Ruth, a 73-year-old woman who used to take weekly walks with her best friend from high school. Over time, those walks became monthly, then yearly, and then not at all. There wasn't a fight, no falling out, just a quiet realization that they no longer had much to say. Their lives had diverged, different interests, different rhythms. Ruth said, "We still care about each other, but I think we said all we needed to say." This experience is more common than people realize. Relationships built on shared seasons, raising kids, working together, living nearby, often don't survive when those seasons end. And as you move into later stages of life, you may find yourself surrounded by people who no longer fit who you are becoming. That's not a failure. It's a form of growth. When you start prioritizing your time and your energy, you naturally become more selective about who you spend it with. Not because you're better than them, but because you're clear about what you need. And sometimes you simply need space. Space to think, to reflect, to be. Old friends who once energized you might now feel draining. Conversations that once flowed might now feel forced. And rather than forcing it, you choose distance not out of malice, but out of self-respect. People often say that aging means losing people. But what they don't always say is that sometimes you let go by choice because you've learned that closeness without connection can be more lonely than being alone. So, when you pull away from certain people, it's not always about avoiding others. It's about honoring the changes within yourself. You've evolved, and that's something to embrace, not apologize for. Reason number 6, the joy of your own company. At some point in life, you stop seeking crowds and start savoring solitude, not out of bitterness, not out of loneliness, but because you've discovered something too many people never learn. Your own company is enough. There's a certain kind of peace that settles over you when you realize you don't have to explain yourself, entertain anyone, or pretend to be more or less than who you really are. For years, you may have been surrounded by others through work, family obligations, and in those years, you might have rarely had a moment to just be, to sit in stillness, to hear your thoughts without interruption. And once you finally taste that freedom, it becomes sacred, not something to escape from, but something to protect. Take Gerald, an 82-year-old man who once lived for social buzz. His house was a gathering spot, his voice the loudest in the room. But in recent years, he finds more joy watching birds from his porch than hosting parties. When asked if he gets lonely, he smiles and says, "I've got enough stories in my head to keep me company for days." What he's discovered isn't loneliness, it's contentment. This shift often confuses those around you. They might worry. They might think you're pulling away out of sadness. But in truth, you're just tuning into something deeper, a rhythm that's quieter but richer, a life that's less crowded but more full. You no longer feel the need to fill every silence or explain every choice or be available to everyone all the time. And that's not avoidance, it's wisdom. It's the kind of inner clarity that comes only after years of noise, of giving, of stretching yourself for the sake of others. Solitude, when chosen, becomes sanctuary. It's where healing happens, where reflection deepens, where your truest self has space to breathe. And the older you get, the more you realize that some of your best days don't involve anyone else at all. You walk at your own pace, think your own thoughts, do what you please. And for the first time in a long time, you feel free. Not because the world has changed, but because you finally claimed your space in IT.so. What spoke to you the most today? Which of these 6 reasons felt familiar, like it was written with your life in mind? Maybe it was a quiet ending of old connections. Or perhaps it was a realization that your craving for peace is no longer something you need to explain. Whatever it was, I hope it reminded you of one important truth. You're not broken, you're becoming. Avoiding people doesn't mean you're bitter or antisocial. It might mean you're wiser. You've lived through decades of experience, and those years have earned you the right to be selective, to guard your peace, to honor your own pace, and to find meaning not in the noise of others, but in the quiet knowing of yourself. There's dignity in solitude. There's strength in boundaries. And there's real freedom in no longer needing to prove your worth through popularity or endless socializing. If you've been drifting away from people, take a moment to ask yourself why. You might find that what you've been seeking isn't absence, it's alignment. And let this narrative be a reminder that even in your stillness, you are seen. Even in your quiet, you are heard. And even in your solitude, you are never truly alone, because there are countless others just like you, navigating the same path with grace, courage, and a deeper understanding of what truly matters. Thank you for taking the time to reflect with me today. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share one thing that resonated with you and how it might influence your perspective moving forward. Your insights are valuable, so please don't hesitate to share them. Reading your comments provides great encouragement and helps build a supportive community. If this narrative resonated with you and offered some clarity, please consider giving it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might also find it helpful. And if you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe for more content like this. Your support helps these messages reach others who might need them. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to connecting with you in the comments and in future discussions.